There is something else going on. If there wasn't something else going on, a relatively obscure professor's amateurish YouTube videos on a relatively obscure piece of Canadian legislation wouldn't have had any effect, right? It would have just disappeared. But it didn't. And that's because there's more going on than the straightforward issue surrounding the pronoun use, and everybody knows it, or everybody feels it at least.
Jordan Peterson makes it clear that he himself has not started anything. He has been a concise and clear advocate for a position of reason and sanity. His popularity is based on the fact that this reasonable position is already understood by so many on a fundamental level. People know that the underlying position held by those on the far left can be taken too far, and Dr. Peterson's popularity is based on the fact that people are simply craving a reasonable voice that calls attention to how this line of reasonableness has been crossed. Jordan Peterson also spoke of this last fall, when his popularity was just beginning. He said, "The right metaphor is that there's a large forest. It's been a hot, dry summer, or maybe a drought, and there's plenty of deadwood gathered, and I lit a spark, and you can't blame the forest fire on the spark. It's just not possible for someone to put up a YouTube video and cause this kind of brouhaha without all of the groundwork already being laid." The groundwork was laid by the post-modernist viewpoint being taken too far, and people are just tired of it. Even if people could not articulate it properly at the time, they could feel that far-left post-modernist political ideology was not the way to go. The left as a whole has been damaged through association, as it's so obvious to reasonable people all over the political spectrum that the far-left thinking is ridiculous, narrow, and closed-minded.
Here, we could lay it out quickly,
okay.
You know, because I've been thinking about how to communicate this properly. And so the thing about the postmodernists, and I'm going to speak mostly about Jacques Derrida because I'll consider him the central villain. Now, he actually, they make a point.
Explain who he is, please.
Well, he's a French philosopher, French intellectual who became quite popular in the late 1970s and then was introduced to North America through the Yale Department of English. And of course, English literature is one of the disciplines that has become entirely corrupt. And so Derrida was a Marxist to begin with, but that fell out of favor because it turned out that Marxist political doctrine kept producing evil empires, and even radical left French intellectuals were forced to admit that by the mid-1970s. You know, they'd put their head in the sand for 20 years, 50 years really, thoroughly in the sand, and made sure their ears were full too. But by the mid-1970s, the evidence that that was the case was so overwhelming that even a French intellectual couldn't deny it anymore, and so they started to play sleight of hand with the Marxist ideas. So instead of trying to promote the revolution of the working class against the capitalist class, let's say, they started to play identity politics and said, well, we can just separate everybody into oppressed versus oppressor, but we don't have to do it on economic grounds. And so we can call it power instead of economics. So that was part of it. And then the other thing, but the fundamental critique that Derrida focused on, this is really worth laying out, because that the problem that he discovered, the postmodernists discovered, was discovered by a variety of other people at the same time in other disciplines. So, for example, among the people who were studying artificial intelligence, since the early 1960s, it was always supposed that we'd be able to make machines that could move around in a natural environment without too much problem. And the reason we could do that was because the world, in some sense, was just made out of simple objects. There they are, and all you have to do is look at them and you see them, and that's vision. And then the complex problem is not how to see or what to see, but how to act in reference to what you see. But it turned out that the AI people ran into this problem, essentially sometimes known as the frame problem. And the frame problem is that there's almost an infinite number of ways to look at a finite set of objects. So the fact that vision, for example, turns out to be way, way, way more complicated than anybody ever estimated. In fact, you can't actually solve the vision problem until you solve the embodiment problem. So an artificial intelligence that doesn't have a body can't really see, because seeing is actually the mapping of the world onto action. And so that was figured out more or less by a robotics engineer called Rodney Brooks. But what's at the bottom of this is the idea that any set of phenomena can be seen a very large number of ways. So like there's a bunch of pens in front of me here, you know, and when I look at them, my brain basically notes that they're a grippable object with which I can write. So I see the function. Like if you look at a beanbag, you see a chair. Not because it's got 4 legs and a seat and a back, but because you can sit on it. And most of what we see in the world, we actually see functionally rather than see as an object and then interpret the object and then figure out what to do. So the function of the object constrains our interpretation. But there's an endless number of interpretations. So for example, if I was going to paint that, paint on canvas this set of pens and try to do it in a photorealistic way, I would be looking at tiny details of these objects, the multiple shades of red that are there and the multiple shades of white and black, and I would decompose it in many ways. And so the AI guys ran into this problem, which was that looking at the world turned out to be exceptionally complex, and that's still being solved now. Okay, in literature, the same thing happened. What the postmodernists realized was that if you took a complex book, let's say the Bible, for example, or a Shakespeare play, there's an endless number of potential interpretations that you can derive from it because it's so complex and so sophisticated. So imagine that, well, you can interpret the word, you can interpret the phrase, you can interpret the sentence, you can interpret the paragraph, you can interpret the chapter. Let's say you have to interpret that within the confines of the entire work, then of the entire tradition, and then within the context of discussion that you're currently having, and all of those things affect how you're going to interpret the play. So their conclusion was, well, there's an infinite number of ways to interpret a text. And then their conclusion was, well, there's an infinite number of ways to interpret the world. And there's a way in which that's correct.
This is what separates Peterson and so many others from the postmodernists on the far left. Peterson can readily accept that some aspects of the position can be correct. It's overly simplistic, however, to assume that everything is a social construct and that a person's behavior or a group of people's behavior can be attributable only to a power game that they are playing within a postmodernist's perspective. Reasonable people can easily see how ridiculous this is. Whether you are on the left, the right, in the middle, have views from both sides, it has taken some time for people to realize that the political ideology held by postmodernists is dangerous. Peterson's popularity is based on people being able to identify with what he's saying, as it's simply a reasonable position that says life can be more complicated than holding firm to a single closed-minded position. Peterson continues discussing the postmodernist belief that there is an infinite number of ways of interpreting the world.
And so the next conclusion was, there's no right way to do it. So you could do it any old way. And then their next conclusion was, oh, and this is where the Marxism creeped up again, oh, people interpret the world in a way that facilitates their acquisition of power. Now that's where the bloody theory starts to get corrupt. Because yes, a bit, but also no, right? Because, and this is why they're wrong. This is why they're wrong. You see, the world is complicated beyond our ability to comprehend. So there is a very large number of ways you can interpret it. But you have to extract out from the world a game from your interpretation that you can actually play. So if the lesson that you extract from Hamlet is you should kill your family and yourself, then we might say that that's not a very functional interpretation, right? Because first of all, people are going to object to that. Right? It ends your life. It ends many people's lives. People are going to object to it. And it isn't a game that you can play over and over again in the world. So when we're interacting with the world, you see, what we're trying to do is to extract out a set of tools that we can use to function in the world because we're constrained by the world so that we don't suffer too much and so that the things that we need in order to continue can be provided. And we need to extract those out in a way that other people will cooperate and compete with us in a peaceful and maintainable way. So then you think, well, we have to extract out an interpretation that allows us to live and thrive over multiple periods of time in multiple environments while we're doing the same thing with other individuals who are motivated the same way. So there's a tremendous number of constraints on our interpretations, and the postmodernists don't care about that at all. All they do is say, well, no, you can interpret the world any way you want. All people are ever doing is playing power games based on their identity, and there's going to be no crosstalk between the power hierarchies. It's not even allowed. That's why they don't engage in dialogue. See, just to talk to, like, let's say if you're a postmodernist, just to have a discussion with someone like you, you know, a heterosexual, what do they call a cisgendered male of power, you know, and white to boot. It's like, that's an evil act in and of itself, because all you're doing by engaging in dialogue with that person is validating their power game. That's all. You see, and this is no aberration that these people don't engage in dialogue. It's no aberration. It's built right into the philosophical system. They regard the idea that if you're in one power group and I'm in another, the idea that we can step out of that group, engage in a dialogue, have our worlds meet, and produce some sort of
understanding of each other.
Yeah, some sort of negotiated understanding. No, that's part of your oppressive patriarchal game. That idea, that whole idea, is part of your game. So if I even engage in the dialogue, I'm playing your game. You win. It's a complete assault. It's a complete. People don't understand that postmodernism is a complete assault on two things. One, it's an assault on the metaphysical substrate of our culture. And I would say that the metaphysical substrate looks something like a religious substrate. So it's a direct assault on that. And the second thing it's an assault on is everything that's been established since the Enlightenment. Rationality, empiricism, science, everything. Clarity of mind, dialogue, the idea of the individual, all of that is not only, you see, it's not only that it's up for grabs. That's not the thing. It's to be destroyed. That's the goal, to be destroyed. Just like the communists wanted the revolution to destroy the capitalist system. It's the same thing. These people, now you might say, well, does every social justice warrior activist know this? It's like, well, no, of course not. It's not any more than every Muslim knows the entire Muslim doctrine or Islamic doctrine, or every Christian knows the entire Christian doctrine. You know, it's fragmented among people. But then when you bring them together, the fragments unite and the entire philosophy acts itself out.
Dr. Jerry Coyne holds a PhD and is a biologist and professor at the University of Chicago. He is one of the world's foremost authorities on speciation and ecological and evolutionary genetics. As a guest on the Rubin Report, he talked about the same issues.
And I try to avoid using the word race just because it's a hot button issue. I'll say ethnic groups or genetic differences. You know, and if you'll talk to the human geneticists that work on this, they'll say, of course, humans are genetically differentiated. We're a species like any other. Yeah. We're animals, so, and we're spread over a huge area, so there's going to be differences that have accumulated by evolutionary processes like selection and drift. But you can't say that. Instead, people say race is a social construct.
Right.
And I don't know what the hell that means. I mean, if it's a social construct, then somebody like Rachel Dolezal can designate herself as black, even though she's not black by any means. But for some reason, they don't like that. People think that evolutionary psychology is a vehicle for enabling sexism. You know, my response to that is always this: to point out that males are bigger and more muscular than females. And that's definitely a genetic difference. And it's the same in virtually every other species of primate, with very few exceptions. And we know why that is. It's because males compete with each other for access for females. There's very good evolutionary theory on that. It's exactly what you expect. We have huge difference in upper body strength. Mating strategies are so clearly different between males and females. Males are fairly promiscuous. Females are choosy, just like they are in other animals. So we have this confluence of lines of evidence that point to this most obvious difference between men and women in body size as a result of what happened in our ancestry. But the fact is that here's a difference that is not cultural. You cannot say that, you know, men and women are socialized. Men are socialized to be bigger than women.
Right.
It just doesn't work that way. If there's such a profound difference in body size that's a result of evolutionary forces, why are we so resistant to thinking that there's evolutionary differences in behavior?
Finally, it's all easily summed up by Simon Baron Cohen, the professor of developmental psychopathology at the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. His work on typical cognitive sex differences and autism is some of the most cited research in the world.
It's a very moderate proposal to say it's a mixture of biology and culture. I'm not saying it's all biology. I'm simply saying don't forget about biology.
Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe. If you liked the video, be sure to leave a comment and hit that like button. If you didn't like it, please explain why. Open discussion is the only way to have a better understanding of differing views. Sharing this video on social media can help keep conversations alive. Now, here are a few other videos that you may be interested in.